Hi, everyone. We'll let everybody get in and we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, I think we'll get started. Good evening and welcome to History Happy Hour, Kurt Vonnegut. My name is Callie McCune and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Indiana Historical Society. I'm so glad to have so many of you here tonight. Tonight's program is brought to you with support from Lake City Bank, offering online banking, mobile banking, and actual in the branch banking. You can find out more at lakecitybank.com, and we're really appreciative to them to helping us make History Happy Hours happen. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions upon millions and maybe a couple more millions of pieces of paper that tell Indiana's unique stories. These are things like books and paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, so many other things that I can list right now. And then we try to find intriguing and unexpected ways to share and remember the past, whether that's through publications, exhibitions, or events like this. It's through these pieces that we tell the diverse, unconventional, and sometimes saucy stories of Indiana and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting principles and values. With last week being what would have been Kurt Vonnegut's 98th birthday, I'm really excited that we get to dive into one of Indianapolis's most notable former citizens, Kurt Vonnegut, and in our 200th year. But before I introduce Susan, our moderator, I have just a few pieces of logistics. For tonight's event, Susan and Chris will chat for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you do have a question as we go along, please feel free to drop it into the question and answer menu on the bottom of your screen. We'll keep an eye on them and pepper as many as we can in the second half of the program. You've all been muted tonight, but we would love to hear your thoughts. Add comments to the chat box as we go along. Just make sure that you're replying to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your reply. Also keep an eye on that chat box. I'll be dropping URLs and links as we go along. Don't worry if you miss one. Most of these links will be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. And just so we're clear, this program is being recorded. You'll be able to catch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, as well as our YouTube page in the upcoming weeks. If you enjoyed this program, we hope you'll consider coming back for more. We have one more History Happy Hour for the year, and that will be on December 30th when we're going to look into the history and the purpose of Kwanzaa. You can sign up for that at indianahistory.org and find out more information about this and other virtual offerings coming to an internet-connected device near you. So without further ado, I'm going to toss this over to Susan Sutton, Director of Digitization at the Indiana Historical Society, to get us started. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Callie, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, we will be talking with Chris Lafave. He's curator with the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library. He was introduced to the work of Kurt Vonnegut while attending Ball State University at the tender age of 23. His first book was Breakfast of Champions, followed closely by the excellent short story collection, Welcome to the Monkey House, on the night Vonnegut died. Chris continued to admire Vonnegut's work throughout a stint playing in bluegrass bands in Chicago, Illinois, and completing his master's in library science at Indiana University. He began volunteering at the Kurt Vonnegut Memorial Library in 2011 at the grand opening. He became curator in 2012 and has continued to serve the organization to this day. Welcome, Chris. We're really happy to have you here with us for this happy hour.
Hi,
and
thank
one
you.
thing we always want to know is, what are you drinking?
Well, this is a complicated question. In the hopes of helping to support local businesses, I do want to mention that Sun King is our sponsor for the year. We are certainly appreciative to them. I did pick up a growler from Escape Velocity Brewery in Lafayette, Indiana. My friends Heather Howard and Jason Behenna run that place. And the reason I'm bringing up a brewery in Lafayette is because Kurt Vonnegut sponsored a softball team in Lafayette, Indiana in the 1970s. So that's why I get to bring it up. Of course, Vonnegut was a humanist and he wanted to support all people. So I probably could leave you a list of a million breweries here. But long story short, I am drinking the Eugene Robust Porter, which is now ricocheting off of my kitchen light, out of my Vonnegut Library pint glass, which I'm about to fill up. And this is made by Revolution Brewery in Chicago. The reason I am drinking this is because it is named the Eugene Porter after Eugene B. Debs, the Terre Haute labor leader, who was a personal hero of Kurt Vonnegut's. So yeah, it all kind of adds together. So I'm filling up my pint glass because once it's got a porter in it, you won't be able to read the words on it. And I am ready to roll for my actual happy hour.
Well, that sounds great. I hope everyone else has settled in with a nice drink or a snack and just get comfortable while we talk about one of America's favorite authors. So, we're here in Indiana. The Vonneguts have long roots in Indiana. What did they do here, and how long? How did his family background influence him?
Well, Kurt's great-grandfather, Clemens, came here from Westphalia, Germany in I'm going to blank on the year now, of course, 1851. And he founded Vonnegut Hardware Store here in 1852. It stayed a family business until about 1965. Kurt actually worked there a couple of summers. He said he figured out what his image of hell was like, running an elevator in a building with only 6 floors. And Clemens was a pretty unique character, super into fitness of the mind and body, very involved in Germanic causes, founded the German American Independent School here. He wrote his own eulogy as well to make sure there wasn't any religious connotation to it. Very powerful gentleman. So all 4 kids went right into the hardware store business, but the 4th, Bernard Vonnegut, that's Kurt's grandfather, he instead went to MIT and became an architect, and he founded the firm Vonnegut & Bone here in Indianapolis. It employed Kurt Vonnegut's grandfather until he passed away at the age of 53, and he left the architecture company to Kurt Vonnegut's Kurt Vonnegut's father, Kurt Vonnegut Sr. And so that had a tremendous effect on his life. He came and gave a speech at the Athenaeum, talked about the legacy of the building, of course, the fact that it was once known as Das Deutsche Haus. They changed the name in World War I with all the anti-German sentiment going on.
Well, how did, with Kurt Vonnegut Sr. being an architect and considering
North Alabama Street, which is an old Unitarian church, that is where the old All Souls were located, and that's where it's a building that Kurt Vonnegut's father designed.
How did his career fare with the onset of the Depression, which of course came when Kurt Jr. was so young?
Yeah, Kurt would have been about 7 when the Depression hit. His siblings would have been much older and on their way out the house. So Kurt sort of bore the brunt of the fact that the architecture company got hit pretty hard, and Kurt Vonnegut Sr. wasn't really able to make the comfortable living that he once was. I want to caution that the Vonneguts didn't go broke in the sense that 30% of the country was living out of cardboard boxes, but they were very used to taking trips to other countries whenever they felt like it. They lived a life of tremendous luxury, and that kind of slowly came to an end because Kurt's parents refused to acknowledge that it was happening on some level. So Kurt's mother started to really have a tough time dealing with it. Kurt said in Timequake, his novel, that my mother was addicted to being rich. She suffered from withdrawals all through the Great Depression. And of course, Kurt's father, he could make furniture and he could paint portraits, but that didn't pay quite the same way that designing a large scale building did.
So that surely had an impact on Kurt's schooling. As I understand it, the older siblings went to private schools, and Kurt is a graduate of Shortridge High School.
Yep, and he was taken out of Orchard Private School and sent to James Whitcomb Riley. He absolutely adored attending Shortridge. He was incredibly fond of his experience there. He played clarinet in the jazz band. He said he played it badly. I've heard other takes on that. But when he met Benny Goodman, he told him that I played a little licorice stick back in the day. And he also served on the Shortridge Daily Echo, which was one of the first daily newspapers at a high school in the country. Yeah, so when he graduated in 1940, he was offered a job at the Indianapolis Times, and his family talked him out of accepting it. They said, "You'll never make a living as a writer."
Mm, wow. Parents aren't always right, are they?
Nope.
So, what was his relationship with his hometown of Indianapolis? How did he feel about the city?
It was complicated from time to time. I think he enjoyed his childhood until the Depression hit, and then enjoyed it less, as you would if your parents were fighting about money pretty frequently. He enjoyed his time at the actual high school. I think he was relatively popular, but he took isolated incidents of bullying, on the chin a little bit. It upset him, as most people would be by it. And then later on in life, I think he felt like his politics weren't understood. Not even his politics, but the effect it had on his personality. In the Cold War, the ramp up to the war, him and Jane were definitely questioners of the idea that there should be an arms race, and I think it went beyond that sometimes.
Yeah. Now, what about maybe his circle of friends from as he was growing up? I think Shortridge has had quite an illustrious group of alums. Do you have any sense of friends that Kurt had as he was growing up that he maintained throughout his life?
Yeah, he was definitely friends with Meiji and Skip Faley. Meiji has written a book about Kurt Vonnegut called "We Never Danced Cheek to Cheek." He was friends with Victor Josie, and his son David is on our board of directors, and he's donated loaned a wonderful portrait of Kilgore Trout, half Kurt's alter ego, half based on Vonnegut himself, half based on science fiction writer Theodore Sturgeon. And so he was well liked and had quite a crowd in high school, and then of course he became close to Dan Wakefield, a local Indianapolis author later on in life. Wakefield is younger than Vonnegut.
Now, when he left Indianapolis, he went to Cornell University. Any idea how that experience might have affected him for the rest of his life?
Man, the story of his life is so convoluted during those first 5, 6, 7 years. Because I don't know if you know this, but Kurt Vonnegut went to 5 universities and received 0 degrees for the vast majority of his life. We believe that college number 1 was ever so briefly Butler University, where he studied journalism. And a professor said, "You write it at a sophomore level." And Kurt said, "That's good. I'm only a freshman." And so he found himself at Cornell in 1941, and his parents had pressured him. His father, who felt like the arts and humanities had ruined his life, and his brother, who was quickly becoming a pretty well-known physicist, convinced Kurt to pick one of the sciences as a way to make a living. And of course, if you're not particularly good at the sciences, or if you don't have an app for it, or maybe your heart isn't in it, you're going to do poorly. So he was a member of the fraternity Delta Upsilon. He did on occasion refer to it as a beer-soaked time. Drank a lot of beer. And he served on the Cornell Daily Sun. And so he hung out with his journalism pals, and he knew some people in the ROTC. He was casually dating Jane Cox, who he had met in elementary school, believe it or not, in Indianapolis. And I think maybe Kurt's lack of direction at the time had drawn a bit of a wedge between them. So between relationship issues and the fact that he got pneumonia and missed a whole lot of class, with his draft number coming up, he just joined the Army in the middle of his junior year. And the Army sent him to Carnegie and the University of Tennessee for heavy artillery training that he wouldn't use during the war. All told, he came within about 2 weeks of having a degree in engineering from the University of Tennessee, but that's when the Army summoned him back to join the 106th Division based out of Camp Atterbury. But you had asked about Cornell. I mean, he was going to be affected by the sciences no matter what. His older brother was so deeply entrenched in that universe. And he later took a job in PR, public relations at General Electric while Bernard, his older brother, was working there. So, I mean, I think Cornell gave him an interesting taste of failing at something, which maybe later in life he would have said is can be a blessing in disguise, although you'll never know it at the time.
Yeah. Pretty good disguise, huh? Well, you alluded to his World War II service, and of course, I think most of us recognize his experience during the war was formative for a lot of his writing later on. Um, would you like to talk about that impact on his writing? Because of course, his experiences in the war followed close on the heels of the death of his mother. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it all started with him being back at Camp Atterbury, not very far away from Indianapolis, of course. And he received leave to come home over Mother's Day weekend. And at this point, Edith Lever has been ingesting alcohol and sleeping pills very heavily. And there is some family debate as to whether she intentionally took her own life or just, died from the combination of alcohol and barbiturates. But it had a tremendous effect on Kurt Vonnegut's life because it happened to be Mother's Day Eve when she passed. And I think even the concepts of privilege that we talk about these days, the Kurt was in the class of soldiers that they were doing everything in their power to kind of keep out of the war. But by the time D-Day came around, I don't think the U.S. military had the flexibility to be picky about anything. And so he found himself, not long afterwards, dropped right into the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, which was an incredibly violent and poorly planned military event that got hit by a giant blizzard. So, everybody involved is lightly armed, lightly dressed. Kurt said bayonets aren't very good against tanks. He also had an uncle that he couldn't stand. And when Kurt came back from the war, the uncle said, "You're a real man now. You've been to war." And Kurt said, "I wanted to kill him. He would have been the only German I ever killed." And that joke, thank you for laughing. That joke doesn't always land. So he found himself marched about 60 miles to a train that took him to Dresden. He won a Purple Heart, which he said he won for frostbite, and called a ludicrously negligible wound, which I personally believe was probably understated. It was probably a pretty bad one. But he found himself in Dresden, and during the day he made vitamins for pregnant women. It was actually a prenatal syrup that they, in a factory that they sneak little spoonfuls of under the penalty of death for theft. And but the nutrients in them probably kept them alive. And in the evening, they were held in a meat locker called Slaughterhouse 5, and that's where he was on the 13th of February, 1945, when British and American airplanes bombed Dresden for about 24 hours and killed by modern day estimates about 25,000 people. So Kurt comes back from the war. He's married to Jane Cox almost immediately, and they move to Chicago, and Kurt believes that he's going to write about Dresden nearly immediately. He's got a little bit of a background in journalism. And he said he'd been trained to write as much as he knew as fast as he knew. And the story just wasn't coming. It looked like a diary entry. It didn't have any flashy or it wasn't so much a story as it was just, this is what happened. And he was never satisfied with it until about 1964, when he got the idea that he writes about in the novel to kind of draw the different plot lines on his daughter's wall in crayon and just kind of see where it all ends up. Because like a lot of writing instructors will tell you, write the ending first and go from there.
Well, speaking of his writing, his popularity seemed to come with a cult following almost, especially with college students. So what do you think it is about his work that still resonates with readers today? And what might make his writing so distinctive?
I mean, I think his sense of humor is used as a coping mechanism for some people. I can tell you, I was 24 when I was living in Chicago, and I just left Ball State, and the economy collapsed, and I was living with 7 hippies at the time, and none of us could pay our bills. And I picked up Cat's Cradle, and I'm looking at this quote right now. He writes, "In the beginning, God created the earth, and he looked upon it in his cosmic loneliness. And God said, let us make living creatures out of mud, so the mud can see what we have done. And God created every living creature that now moveth, and one was man. Mud as man alone could speak. God leaned close to mud as man sat up, looked around and spoke. Man blinded him. What is the purpose of all this? He asked politely. Everything must have a purpose, asked God. Certainly, said man. Then I leave it to you to think of one for all of this, said God. And he went away. That sense of humor doesn't work for everybody, but I think when I found myself in Chicago, that was really, really comforting. When you know so many people who were told to go to college and eat vegetables and never stay out past 12, and don't worry, nothing bad will ever happen to you in Vonnegut. It's a nice coping mechanism for all that was terribly, terribly untrue.
Sort of like becoming an adult, and sometimes it's almost as if somebody smacks you across the face and says everything you know is wrong.
The one thing your parents don't know how to prepare you for, they can tell you to tuck your shirt in and eat kale, but they can't the minute you're done with your educating. It's like, okay, now it's up to you.
Yeah, we know that, right now we're talking about a world famous author. But we know he struggled for a long time before he could just make his living off his writing. What kind of things did he do in the interim, and how did he evolve to succeed?
Well, he taught at the university. He after the war, Kurt and Jane, they moved to Chicago. Jane was getting her master's degree in Russian literature. She'd been a straight A student at Swarthmore. And she'd worked for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA during World War II. So if I ever get around to writing fan fiction, she'll be a U.S. spy for sure, because what better cover than Kurt Vonnegut as your husband? Kurt has the part-time job with the City News Bureau in Chicago. He's the low man, the totem pole. He's the guy that gets a phone call at 3 a.m. when someone gets murdered and you have to go interview the neighbor. He didn't care for the job too much. So the university had a bachelor's to master's program in cultural anthropology, which Kurt found very interesting. He called it poetry masquerading as science, and that's how I got away with studying it. The reason I'm taking so long to tell you this is because I truly believe that his 2 years, barely 2 years spent as an anthropological student, had a profound effect on his life. The concept of folk societies and how societies can maybe govern themselves well and also govern themselves poorly. That was a big impact on his life. But Jane became pregnant with Mark Vonnegut at 46. And Kurt went to go turn a thesis about the similarities between Native American artwork of the Goshen Rebellion and Cubist painters from Spain, and they rejected that. So Kurt's older brother, the brilliant physicist, works for GE, and he gets Kurt a job in public relations there. And Kurt writes short stories in the evening. And in 1950, he sends in a short story called Report on the Barnhouse Effect to Collier's Magazine. And the guy writing the rejection letter, so this was a job back in 1950, you could read people's short stories and then give detailed reasons for why you were saying no, which is fascinating to most people. And he at the bottom, there's a postscript where he talks about how it's a little sententious, which turns out to mean smart alecky. So it's sententious to use the word sententious. And he eventually gives Vonnegut, after a couple of rewrites, $750 for that short story. 4 stories later, he got paid $12.50, and he quit his job right away. Kurt lived in Barnstable, Massachusetts, which is out in Cape Cod, from about 1951 to 1970. He owned the second Saab dealership in the United States, promptly ran it right into the ground. We know he did a lot of contract advertising, did the kind of writing like you've seen the TV show Mad Men. He wasn't able to live the lifestyle with 3 kids at home, soon to be 7. But he he was able to do, if someone needed writing for a commercial or an advertisement of some kind, he would do that. And of course, in 1958, his sister died of cancer. Her husband was killed in a train accident 48 hours previously. And Kurt ended up adopting all four of her children. The youngest one with another relative 9 months out of the year, but it was a pretty big challenge for the family to keep a roof over their head. So Kurt worked at a school for juvenile delinquents, and he worked for Sports Illustrated for less than a day. You can look that story up. It involves some pretty colorful language. And yeah, so it wasn't until Cat's Curator, which he'd been working on for about 17 years, came out in 1963. It got just enough attention to get passed around college campuses. Someone got sick at the last minute at the University of Iowa, and he was hired on as a college professor there for the writers' workshop. And the amount of free time he had there versus the absence of domestic responsibility, he got a lot of work done on Slaughterhouse-Five, both there, and then the Guggenheim Foundation did give him a grant to go back to Dresden and finish his war novel in '67. He'd also met a guy named Sam Lawrence, who was running Dell Publishing at the time. And Vonnegut had written a review of a dictionary, and we have this at the Vonnegut Museum. And the review of the dictionary is very goofy. It's very fun. Vonnegut thought the assignment was kind of hilarious. President Lyndon Johnson had evidently told a reporter to cool it, which was a big presidential scandal because they felt it hadn't been King's English enough for the president of the United States to use. I'm just going to let you sit with that was a presidential scandal in 1966. So Vonnegut defended Johnson and said we had bigger fish to fry, and that was truly hilarious. So anyway, Sam Lawrence read that review and said, I got to meet this guy. If he can make a dictionary review funny, what else can he do? And sure enough, Vonnegut shows him Slaughterhouse-Five, which is an anti-war book involving space and time travel in the late 1960s. And immediately offers him $65 grand for Slaughterhouse-Five of his next two novels. Vonnegut said, you're out of your mind, my books don't sell. And Sam Lawrence said, you worry about the writing, I'll worry about the money. It's about 480 grand or so today.
Yeah. So, we've talked a little bit about his experiences. He was known, though, for his legacy of creativity and civil discourse. You touched on that a little bit. Could you give us some examples of that? He was quite civil to a lot of people, although some of his opinions may not have been expressed in a very civil manner sometimes.
I think he found himself a contradiction in many of those situations. It's fascinating. Slaughterhouse-Five, by today's standards, probably isn't the most vulgar or profane thing you've ever seen. But back in 1969, I think some of the language, some of the satire on the Bible, where he talks about if you're going to crucify someone, make absolutely sure they're not well connected first. There are the sex scene. There's the sex scenes with Montana Wildhack on the planet Tralfamadore. There's the Shetland pony photograph. There's a lot in Slaughterhouse-Five that various moral censors had a major problem with it. So the Slaughterhouse-Five comes out in the middle of a really, really unpopular war and has a lot of financial and social muscle behind it. So half the country is shoveling Slaughterhouse-Five into its schools and libraries as fast as they possibly can. The other half is lighting it on fire in very public book burnings. And Kurt, who was interestingly sensitive to criticism, especially some of the bad reviews of his 1970s novels, which of course are somewhat more renowned today as postmodernism gains more and more acceptance. Wrote a very, very intense letter to the head of the school board in North Dakota, where they had been burning his book in an incinerator. And he was furious, absolutely furious. And he talks about how my books don't argue for wildness of any kind. I am a father. I've raised 7 children. I've, served in a war. I don't do drugs, and he really didn't. So he had this very. It's very interesting as someone who was so involved with the ACLU and such an advocate for absolute freedom of speech, and he was fond of people like Hunter S. Thompson. He was fond of people like Abby Hoffman. But like everybody in the world, he had a line. And it's funny. We were talking about free speech and common decency in a different podcast just a week ago, and I found this fascinating, interview where he was talking a little bit about his line. How he was just beyond repulsed by neo-Nazis marching in Skokie, and how he was beyond repulsed apparently by Larry Flint. Which I'd never heard before until I read this. This article, and he wasn't arguing for them to be censored or arrested or anything like that, but he was definitely alluding that he thought they were filth. And so I think he had he had to dance around that. I don't know what the word Midwestern values means, but I think he had a tremendous respect for the idea that you could be kind to someone for no reason, even if you disliked them, even if you had nothing in common with them. I think, he was of that generation that if he discovered caller ID, he'd be like, "So you mean you intentionally ignore phone calls?" That type of thing.
Yeah. Yes. It's as if he takes the word humane very seriously.
Extremely seriously. I think, especially if you read Slapstick, which is Vonnegut's worst reviewed novel. It's a misunderstood work of genius, in my slightly biased opinion. He talks really heavily about how lonely we all are and how easily we could be a little bit better. And it's this silly, hilarious novel where he talks about being president of the United States, and he borrows the idea from Alcoholics Anonymous of having huge artificial families where everybody would have like 100 relatives or 1,000 relatives based on strange names like Dr. Wilbur Daffodil II. And it's actually kind of a, it's a plausible plot as much as a crazy novel like Slapstick can be. But I think he was putting a lot of effort into there's just little ways in which you can be a huge help to someone in a difficult world. And Vonnegut was kind of a master of pointing those things out.
Yeah. Well, so how does the Vonnegut Library keep Kurt's legacy alive today?
Well, that's a long one. Well, we have some of his personal effects, and we give tours of the museum. I saw the questions are coming in quickly, but I saw someone ask when the museum will reopen. We are actually open for tours based by appointment currently. And so you can come in and see. We have a first floor, which is a freedom of expression exhibit. And there's actually an art and politics exhibit currently on display. I don't know how much longer it'll be up there. We have a recreation of Vonnegut's workspace. Down there, you can see that he was 6'2" and he wrote hunched over on a 45-degree angle on a coffee table. He said the pain helped him concentrate. On the second floor, we got some of Kurt's Indiana effects, yearbooks. Can't believe I blanked on that word. He has a letter to someone who used to work at the Vonnegut hardware store. We have an exhibit dedicated to the play Happy Birthday 1 to June, which was turned into an opera in 2016 by Butler University. A ton of Vonnegut's artwork, a digital collection of his papers. And on the third floor, we have a Slaughterhouse-5 exhibit. As far as programming goes, we try to scale the map as much as we can. We publish a literary journal to get the arts and humanities out there. We try to make as many opportunities for veterans artwork to get out there. We have Banned Book Week, which the ALA created, the American Library Association. In the summer of 2011, there was a college professor in Missouri who was homeschooling his own children. And he was so offended the local school library had Slaughterhouse-5 that he demanded it be removed. And they did, and we started mailing free copies of Slaughterhouse-5 to kids in the area who wanted to read it. And so ever since then, we've had people living in the front of our library as a protest against censorship during Banned Book Week. The most recent person to do it was Manon Boyce. She's a local Indianapolis advocate and poet. Before that, there was a teacher named Brett Stoker who teaches Slaughterhouse-5. Before then, Ray Peterson was a professor at Ball State. So we've had some really cool people come and live in our museum to protest censorship, and we've had all kinds of cool programming involved in the evenings with that. It's a little different this year. We had an outdoor fundraiser on October 1st. It was pretty cold, but it was a ton of fun too. we danced the Charleston, which evidently offended the censors at one point or another.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
Which is something Vonnegut would have loved. Apparently, he was a hell of a dancer.
Oh, yeah. I've heard that.
It's
Well,
easy to picture, isn't it?
oh, oh yeah, it is. It's easy to picture. So, I've heard you mention several books. Do you mind telling us if you have a favorite among all the Kurt Vonnegut books?
Man, after you study him professionally for a decade, it does become strange. It's like, Kerouac towards the end of his life said, "This is the Deloise legend. It's everything thrown together." But I will say I definitely have a couple. Cat's Cradle, just because it was so profoundly influential. Like if you need a way to laugh at something that's technically not funny, and we're learning in the last couple of years that that's a really challenging thing to do, to make people laugh at difficult subject matters. So that's really up there. Breakfast of Champions, I think, is a really, if you read it quickly with attention paid to the story, I think it's a really, really amazing novel. And some of the ones that don't get as much attention, Slapstick, Bluebeard, Mother Night is a phenomenal novel. It stands alone in so many ways. It's a very atypical Vonnegut novel. And The Sirens of Titan. I'm a fanatical Deadhead. Jerry Garcia had the movie rights for a long time. And it's such a tragedy. He worked on 2 screenplays with Tom Davis, Al Franken's writing partner. And the guy from Rick and Morty has the screenwrites now, so I'm just hoping and praying that there'll be a Sirens of Titan, Grateful Dead soundtrack, Rick and Morty-esque film sooner or later. So I over answered your question, but probably Cat's Cradle. I'm reading the shirt, wearing the shirt right now.
Yeah, I noticed that when we first came on screen, that was actually the first one I read. And I probably read it too young because the Ice Nine just terrified me. The book was just there on the table in the living room. It belonged to one of my older siblings. Don't know which one. I picked it up, plowed through it, and was terrified. So, it's amazing how, we read things, and our experiences and maturity determines how much we understand of what the author intended and how much we just interpreted on our own.
I think that's really true. That is fascinating to me. I've met every Vonnegut fanatic under the sun, because our place is definitely a pilgrimage for a lot of people. I don't mean to toot my own horn, but we've gotten people from Australia and Brazil and everywhere under the sun. And 50% of them, maybe even more, will list Slaughterhouse-Five as their favorite, but the number of people who just pick a different novel, it's really surprising. He just had out of 14 novels and a whole lot of collections of short stories and essays, he just had a lot of reach and a lot of influence, and over a lot of people. And John Green, another big Indianapolis author, has this funny quote where he says, "Reading is a beautiful thing it's a quiet thing you can do in a world that doesn't make time for all that." And I'm saying this because you mentioned one of your siblings having Kurt Vonnegut books. My dad wasn't a reader of his on his own. I don't think he could ever calm down enough to sit with a book. But he had this habit of hanging out at my mom's house in Northern Ontario, and he'd get bored, and he would start looking around various bookshelves, and he knew me and my brother were writers or readers. So years later, when he passed and my mom was going through his things, she found all these 1970s Kurt Vonnegut books that were really something to come across. And after a couple of tug of wars, I think I got them all back from my brother, who was much faster and swifter than me, and didn't care that I was the curator of the Vonnegut Museum. But it was a neat thing to come across.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to talk to people and find out just what literature they love, what literature they relate to, or which authors they would probably most like to actually get to talk to. I would imagine you probably do get a lot of people who really are sorry they're walking into the memorial library rather than stepping up there and knocking on the door of that brownstone in New York.
Yeah, the emotion has occurred on occasion. There was a guy whose son was visiting from Utah for an experimental cancer treatment with Riley, and him coming in, having to get out of the hospital for a little while, and chatting with me for about 5 hours about Bob Dylan and Kurt Vonnegut and the Grateful Dead and all kinds of topics. Those powerful personal interactions really stick with you. I don't know. I don't mean to harp upon it, but I think he was just that funny about that scary of subject matters that people found a tremendous bond with the guy.
Yeah, I think when you know a little more about Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s life, when you know about the tragedy of his mother's passing just before Mother's Day, and then on the heels of that, being taken prisoner by the Germans during World War II, and just being a POW was an horrendous experience. But to have been in that underground vault during the bombing of Dresden, which many people, especially the people in Dresden, thought would never happen because it was such a fine city and had so much cultural history, then to emerge from that bunker to the experience that he had, it's formative and horrendous. And some people would crawl into themselves and never emerge, and others, like Kurt Vonnegut, have to find some way to express it, and sometimes it comes out as humor.
Yeah, and the funny thing was his sense of humor, he always said, came from having older siblings. He said, just the fact that he fundamentally had one. He said his sister was 5 years older, his brother was 9 years older. If you don't want to get completely ignored around the dinner table, you better be funny. The quasi gallows humor, I think, it does come from a hard place. I can't deny that, but like you said, he tried to look at the upside, and there were always these little things, like his wife would always give him a hard time because he would walk all the way from the house to the post office to buy one stamp, and she goes, "You're not a poor person. Why do you do that?" And he goes, "Well, it gives me a chance to get out there in the world. I flirt with the lady behind the desk. I get to wave to some dogs. I see some really cute babies." Just this very, sometimes you do get a chocolate chip cookie and not an oatmeal raisin one, and there's something really beautiful about that. No disrespect intended to oatmeal and raisins, a little bit. And I think he carried a lot of that with him.
Yeah. Well, I think we do have some questions, and one of them I think is really interesting, and I know that it's one I've read was a bit of a struggle. How would you describe Vonnegut's understanding of what it meant to have a German identity, and did he consider German as any part of his identity? And of course, this relates to his birth just a few years after World War I, and then his experiences during World War II.
Well, I know Bill Selm, who's an Indianapolis German history expert, and he really went into detail about just how messed up it kind of became, because you got to realize in the 1911s or teens or what have you, this is a heavily Germanic area. So it's not like there's 7 Germans living here. It's a huge part of the culture. And just as recently as Kurt's great-grandfather, you're dealing with very, very proud, patriotic, in tune with their culture, Germans. So Kurt's family with World War I became the first family, generation, so to speak, to not speak German as a primary language in the home. So Kurt was the first Vonnegut generation to only be taught 50 rudimentary German words here and there. And he talked about it in that Athenaeum speech. I think if you look up Vonnegut Athenaeum speech 1996 at the Athenaeum, I think it's in Nouveau. If you read that, he talks very passionately about the fact that, my family was very proud, and we were proud of German music, of theater, of art. There was only one Germany that we weren't exactly proud of. And, when I was captured at the Battle of the Bulge, this is Kurt speaking. He's just shouting. They would say, "Why are you making war against your brothers?" And Vonnegut said, "I thought that was absurd." And so would General Eisenhower, which I think that joke, sort of brought the house down. Plus, he admitted to not liking bratwurst, which broke my heart into a billion pieces. So that was a really challenging subject matter because I think his great grandfather probably did believe in nationalism to a certain degree, even if it wasn't necessarily American nationalism. And Kurt, as early as Mother Night, is just completely and utterly mortified by the entire concept of borders. And I don't know if that was a majority opinion then. It's probably not now, but I think he really believed that the human race is just kind of one group of people, while simultaneously believing that maybe small groups of people in small circles would be best for maintaining some kind of societal stability, which is ironic for a guy that lived an enormous part of his life in New York City.
Yeah. So,
human beings contain all kinds of contradictions, though.
Someone would like to know if you have some little known fact that you'd like to share about Kurt Vonnegut, maybe something that people forget to ask about.
He had tons. He was really, really into ping pong. He would play ping pong in this dive bar in New York City with his friend Sidney Offutt. He did not care for marijuana. He smoked once with Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead, and it didn't do anything to him, and so he never did it again. I've already told you he didn't like bratwurst, which is painful. He didn't like Bob Dylan, which was really painful. So yeah, he had sort of a straight-laced side to him, and a much more goofy and playful side to him, and they sort of coexisted side by side. I think when the Jefferson Airplane showed up hallucinating on his front lawn, he really didn't know what to make of that. And I know him and Kurt and Dan Wakefield went to a commune in 1971, and they were kind of giving them a tour around the place. And they said, "We aim to be the last people on Earth." And Kurt mentioned to Dan Wakefield, "Isn't that sort of a stuck-up thing to want to be?" So I mean, there's trust me, the line goes down. I think I'll still be forever hilarious. Have hilarious feelings about the 1961 letter to the editor that Vonnegut wrote to Look magazine, and I can forward this to Callie because I'm just now thinking of this. But anyway, I won't remember it off the top of my head. But it's a funny letter to the editor where he's tearing someone a new one for defending Little League Baseball. And he's talking about how Little League Baseball has completely destroyed the American dinner hour. And the games are played when most families are eating supper. Supper time was about the last fairly lovely, civilized thing to be expected in the day of a family. And Little League Baseball has wrecked it. It's just like this. His vocabulary is 10 miles above sea level, and he's talking about how much Little League Baseball pisses him off. It's so funny, and I didn't get it until I had kids of my own, and now I totally understand what he's talking about. The 5 seconds that families have to talk to each other, and this is 1961 too, so it's funny stuff. I overran the question.
Well, we also have a question about whether there's a lesser known work or collection by Vonnegut that you'd like to put in a plug for. Maybe there's a short story that people just don't pay enough attention to.
Sorry, one more time. Lesser known works. Okay. Harlan Ellison died somewhat recently. He collected a book called Again, Dangerous Visions in the 1970s. So if you want to look up a short story called The Big Space, 4-letter word that starts with F, that's a super rare and entertaining piece of work. He swore up and down that it was the only short story out there with the F word in the title. And then I think if you go to Bagombo Snuffbox, there's the short story Poor Little Rich Town, which I think is just a masterpiece. I really love that. The Foster Portfolio from Welcome to the Monkey House. And then his visual artwork. I think is just, there's a book that Nanny, his daughter, collected called Kurt Vonnegut Drawings that is just unbelievable.
Yeah, I think probably there are a lot of folks out there who don't realize that he was actually a pretty accomplished artist. And some of it is really neat. So someone else, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, someone else is asking a question, kind of an aside from the Vonneguts, and she's asking, what about Kurt's mother's family, the Lebers? What kind of influence might the Lebers have had on Vonnegut's life? Because they were actually a pretty prominent family, especially among the German community here in Indianapolis.
Yeah, Bill Selm, the German history guy, not long after the grand opening, told us that the part of the history of the building we're currently in is it was a bar once upon a time in the 1900s and tens, and they probably would have been serving Indianapolis Brewing Company beer and Leber tonic and the stuff that Kurt's maternal grandfather and great grandfather were working on. There was a phenomenal amount of family money there. They were really involved with the state park system here in Indiana. The Leber State Park, Leber Road, they're all connected to her family. It really was arguably the most expensive wedding in Indianapolis history up until that point when they got married. So I'm sure the influence was tremendous, but when Prohibition hit, I think it's Arthur Leber didn't feel like hanging around. So he went off to Europe, and there's some debate as to how big that inheritance was. I don't think it was all that much, but I don't know that Vonnegut. I think Vonnegut spent a lot of his life lower middle class, which meant he wasn't looking at being homeless tomorrow, but he you want to be ahead of that, and you want to feed your kids, and you want them to have health and dental insurance, and you want them to have something for school, and you want them to have something for when you go. So it's suddenly becomes a very complicated thing, especially when you have 3 of your own and 4 of your sisters. Like that's a lot going on. So I think Kurt Vonnegut Sr., Kurt's dad, and Edith Leber were pretty despondent about that when the Depression hit.
We have another question that relates to Kurt's educational background. And I'm actually going to read this question. Do you think Vonnegut's almost engineering degree influenced his writing? You mentioned him diagramming the Slaughterhouse-Five story on the wall. Sounds very engineer-like. So, how much do you think that engineering background might have affected his writing?
I think it's even bigger than that. I think the hodgepodge random stew of everything he learned and everything that he tried, he threw his whole life into his work. If you've read any of his work, Indianapolis shows up there, Chicago shows up there, anthropology shows up there, religion shows up there. He came from a long line of free thinkers or humanists, as he preferred. Everything that occurred to him in his life, if you learn enough about him, shows up in his work. I think he had the artistic talent to begin with to draw something out as a map. But I do think, just because you are bad at science to the point where you can't get a good grade in it, or engineering, doesn't mean that you won't have picked up something. So I think that's a very keen insight that he just, he gave a great speech about that later on in life. He talked about how he had virtually no literature training of any kind, which is funny because he taught literature at the University of Iowa, and he taught it at Harvard very briefly before not wanting to do it again, never. But I think when he was at the University of Iowa, Kurt and Dick Yates, the guy that wrote Revolutionary Road, they teach a class on all the hack work that you're going to have to do in order to support yourself. And I think a lot of that is inspired by the fact that he just he wanted to be a writer, but no one had ever backed him up, and he wasn't aware, as many young people are not aware, he didn't realize that he had the freedom to say, I'm going to do my thing and you can call me later if you really want to, because almost no person between the ages of 16 and 20 whatever has the confidence or comfort to do that.
Yeah, I think that's just a really great thing for us to end with. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, but I think that thought of Vonnegut laboring and doing something that he was committed to. So we are going to thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn back over to Callie McCune.
Yeah, thank you both so much for a great conversation. I learned a lot. I now want to go play ping pong with the Vonnegut Library. So as we mentioned at the top of the program, we will have one more history happy hour for the year, and that's on the purpose of Kwanzaa on December 30th. We'll hope you'll join us for that conversation. And with the holidays right around the corner, you can now visit the Indiana History Center in person and online for our annual Festival of Trees, where community partners decorate trees and share some of their resources. Along with the exhibition comes several programs, whether you're looking for crafts for the family, an evening celebration for you, or opportunities to see some beautifully decorated trees. You can find them all at festivaloftreesindy.org, and Brianna's going to drop that in the chat for you. And you can sign up and find out all about this at indianahistory.org. We'll post this conversation to the IHS YouTube channel and our website in the upcoming weeks. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about some favorite Indiana topics like Ernie Pyle, donuts, Ohio River Pirates, and so much more, you can watch the replay of previous History Happy Hour conversations in our playlist on YouTube. If you missed a chance to donate or would like to make a further gift to the Indiana Historical Society, please visit the link that Brianna's going to put in the chat. Your donation allows us to continue to share Hoosier stories and put on events like this. And last but not least, you'll get an email from us in the morning with links along with a survey included. It will take you 1 minute. We'd love to know what you thought and how we can make programs like this better in the future. With that, I hope you stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy, have a fabulous Thanksgiving, and we hope to see you again in the future. Bye, everybody.